All right, everybody, welcome back to Apex Mind. Adam McDaniel here with you as always, and I am pleased to welcome to our show on this episode, Fred Baker. Welcome, Fred.
Hello, everybody. Thanks,
Well,
Adam, for having me.
yeah, I'm glad to have you. And just like a lot of the guests, we're people that we've met online through social media and had some good conversations, and that's led to going a little bit more in depth on different subjects. And I figured that your experience and expertise would benefit the audience. So why don't you just give a brief background of kind of what your role is in the L&D space and what brought you to this place?
So my life story is so all the way back to high school. I went to some public schools that were sort of challenging, and it wasn't a good space for me. And so coming out of that, had a really rough time in high school, and it was later before I went to college or anything. And for me, my undergrad was just a much different experience than my high school. And so during that time, I had a lot of interaction with my professors, and just it was a different space. You were responsible for everything. And so I decided at that time, it had such a profound effect on me in the way that I think about things. And I was already at that point married and had my first child and everything. So to me, it really set this fire to go learn how to do that for other people. And so what I wanted to do was to teach college. That for me was just sort of this space where I felt comfortable and fulfilled, and it was like different than anything I'd seen before. So my undergrad, I graduated in 2008 with an undergrad in entrepreneurship, and my goal at that point was to go teach college. And so a couple more years go by, and I land in a pre-doctoral program for instructional design, because that you have to have a doctorate to teach college. And that was the doctorate that was around, right? I was in an undergrad in business, and I kind of wanted something a little more humanized than what I perceived business to be. It was very like, let's put people in categories and numbers and boxes. And I didn't want to do that. So instructional design sounded intriguing. It was sort of introduced to me as the intersection between business and teaching or education and psychology. And I had a minor in psychology. So for me, it felt right. And so in 2010, I started that doctoral program, that pre-doctoral program, and I finished that in 2014. During that time, I developed a research agenda and all kinds of things, started teaching more. And I graduated in 2014, and I thought, okay, I'm going to go right in and get a faculty job. Well, anybody who's ever tried to get a faculty job knows that is not usually how it works. They're hard to get. And it was another 4 years before I got a faculty job. That faculty job was very temporary. And we can talk about this more, but it ended in May 2020. So 2014 to 2018, I did a lot of instructional design in higher ed. I did a lot of project management, because a lot of the instructional design tasks that I had were developing online courses and training and things like that, which is not where I wanted to spend my time. So I was always sort of trying to escape that thread, do a lot of project management, and get involved in large scale implementation and strategic initiatives and things like that. So 2018 to 2020, I got to teach for a little while. That was a great experience. May 2020 was peak COVID. Everything was shut down. My contract ended. I had nothing going, no sort of hope for getting another job in higher ed. There's a huge gap, a chasm even, to transition from instructional design in higher ed to instructional design hireable as an instructional designer in a corporate space. It's just a different skill set. And so I wasn't able to sort of quickly and immediately get a position in corporate training. And even I think that having a doctorate probably worked against me in that space. So I was left to figure out what I was going to do. And I started freelancing. I started a freelance firm in 2020, July 2020, and started building e-learning, and that transitioned into project management. I also picked up another full-time gig, which is another 2-year temporary gig in higher ed, where I've been able to do more strategic initiatives, and that ends in November. So I'm right now trying to transition into project management more full-time, but it's the arc highlights.
That's a great story, Fred. And there's a lot I want to touch on there, but I want to go back to one of the early things when you talked about how, early in your schooling, you had some challenges, and then it seemed like you had a spark that was, fostered when you went to university. So what was the difference between the let's say, poor experience you might have had earlier in your schooling career versus what might have made you more passionate when you had gone to college?
That's a really good question. I'll go ahead and be completely open. So I'm 43 now, and just in the last 2 years, maybe, I realized that I'm neurodivergent, and that wasn't something that I didn't know until I was 41 or so, right? So most of my adult life, I've gone through this without that. And in high school and in middle school even, and I didn't go to the best public schools. I'm sure a lot of people have a similar experience, but it was very authoritarian, and the idea is just about control, in my experience. And that's certainly not generalizing to all public schools or anything like that, but my experience was one where it was a lot of like sit down and shut up and ask for the hall pass to go use the restroom, and made worse by the fact that it was sort of an impoverished area and there was a lot of danger and things like that happened. So it just wasn't a good space that fostered learning, and the spaces that were good that fostered learning were more about like dominance and control than about like sort of flourishing and encouraging people to like recognizing the human. It's more about like, we've got to get this done, sit down, shut up, here's your task list and just hit the button, right? And I don't think that learning works like that. It's definitely not. You need a good environment. You need a space where you're allowed to sort of bend the rules or step out of the bounds or color outside of the lines and just sort of experiment and feel free and that kind of thing. So higher ed was different to me than that. It was when I went to school with higher ed first when I was 23, and I actually have a GED. I didn't finish high school. So in the month I turned 16, or not the month I turned 16, but 2 months after I turned 16, I wasn't in high school anymore. So from 16 to 23, I was just out being a hoodlum and doing whatever sort of stuff people do.
Yeah.
But at 23, I matured enough and was married. And 23, you start school, you're now a non-traditional student, right? Most students starting undergrads 18, 19, 20 years old right after they finish. So I was already in a different space than a lot of my peers at the time. And, I was married. A lot of people weren't married at the time. I had my first son on the way. A lot of people, weren't in that space. So it was just a different experience for me from that lens. And also the fact that there was just this level of respect, right? Like, I'm here to help you walk, but if you decide not to do what you need to do and you fall, that's on you, right? There wasn't this like command and control sort of society. It was like, you don't show up to class and I'm just going to mark you not there, and you fail the class and you get to repeat it next semester. No big deal,
Yeah.
And it sounds hard, but that's, when you are lifting weights or something and you pick up too much weight, you go, crap, I better not do that again. And I'll step it back and make sure that I can handle it next time. It's the same sort of mentality, at least in my experience.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that story. I feel like mine had some similarities in the fact that I became very disengaged in high school. College was more appealing because of, I always think about it like autonomy and respect.
Yeah,
they actually allowed you to make some of those decisions.
Yeah.
My guess would also be that in that gap between 16 and 23, maybe it's a combination of getting married and having a child on the way. You also potentially had more purpose and you had more of a reason to go do the learning that you were doing.
For sure. Yeah, definitely autonomy was a big part of it. Certainly purpose, like I'm delivering pizzas and stuff, right? I'm like, what am I going to do with my life, right? I can't do this forever. And in restaurants, for anybody who's ever worked in restaurants, they're not an easy business to be in. I spent a long time in restaurants, and for me, like my kids now, we have 4 sons. I'm just trying my best to help them avoid a lot of the sort of pitfalls that I have, which I think any parent does, and so my hope is that they never have to experience like life in a restaurant or at least be trapped there. I mean, it's you run into other challenges that way, right? I heard Bill Gates one time say how hard it was to like have all this money, because when your kid says, hey, I want a pony, you have to actually say no. You can't say like, I can't afford a pony because you're Bill Gates, right? Like,
Yeah.
No, you can't have a pony. And that's a different situation when you have kids. So like my kids don't understand some of the challenges that we went through. So I think too, there's something about being, like you said, autonomy, being able to sort of choose your own path. In K-12, we're assigning you to go to social studies at 10 o'clock. You're going to PE at 11. You're going to whatever. Like, they make the schedule. You get to pick your own schedule. You get to pick your major. You get to pick your classes. If you don't like one, you get to choose how much effort you put into it. It's a much different beast. So
yeah, definitely. I also worked a lot of like food and retail from the time, like starting at 16 when I could get my first job until I was able to get a more corporate type job in my mid 20s. I did that for a number of years. And I agree with you that nobody should aspire to be in that area for a long time. But I will say that everybody should probably try it once when you're young, because it does give you a different perspective and a different level of respect for people that have those service type jobs, because they are really hard. And I don't know if we give them quite the level of respect of what the hard work is.
I've never worked as hard for as little as I have in the service industry. And the sad part is that when you come out, you see how much easier, at least in my experience, like you see how much easy, even though I'm not necessarily making the money I'd like to make and all that stuff, I'm making a lot more for relatively a lot less effort than I was at that time. And it's just a completely different perspective on like the amount of effort. If you think about the amount of effort that you have to expend to produce like money or benefit or whatever, the ratio is completely different. And it's not just because I'm older, it's because I'm in a different industry. And you really, like, if you think about where you've been and all of that, like if I told myself, if I ever start getting frustrated with my career, I'll just go sit at the Waffle House or something for a little while, because it'll bring it all right back.
Yeah, I feel that same way whenever I'm at a fast food place and I see a customer like being rude to the employee. It just it's terrible. But I do want to touch on your experience working in universities, because I know we've had a few exchanges on just different views, and sometimes I might come across as someone who's very critical of schooling, and that's not because I think it's worthless or it should go away. It's more because I want it to be better. So let's start off with this perspective. So someone like me who might be more critical of colleges and universities, given the changes to society and stuff over the years, what would you say is the top benefits in 2022 of a kid still going to university and getting their 4-year degree? What are they getting out of that?
Yeah, well, and so to varying degrees, higher ed is still like this, but it encourages you to be critical of it, right? Like the fact that you can think critically and take an opposing side to something and chew on it and say, this is what's good about that, and that's what's bad about that, and here's where I stand on that because of X. That is the spirit of education. Exactly that. And so higher ed is really just an advanced level of that. Like in K-12, you do some of that, but it's mostly like getting a foundational knowledge level. I understand how to do math. I have some basic history facts. Like, and I don't mean to discount that, because there's a lot of critical thinking that goes into K-12 also. But in higher ed, like the idea is it's completely optional. Although that may be challenged right now that so many jobs require degrees and that kind of thing. But the spirit of it, I'll separate the spirit of higher ed from the execution of higher ed, because they're different. But the spirit of higher ed, I would argue, is one where you're encouraged to sort of think deeply and critically about things and challenge the status quo and take different perspectives and really just sort of step back and say, what is it about this that makes it meaningful, that separates us from what can be automated? And one example of that, I've taught a lot of instructional design over the years, and what I always sort of advocate, no matter what class I'm teaching, is that instructional designers are designers in a design field. And that has some challenge, right? Because we started off as a science and we were trying to be prescriptive and say, okay, here are the variables in the environment, here are the variables in the learner. And if we sort of prescribe this set of events, that's Gagne's 9 events and all, if we prescribe this set of events, it facilitates learning. And so this idea that we can be super scientific with learning, and if I inject X amount of this, then I get Y amount of that out, that's a valid perspective. But I don't think that it sort of captures the spirit of instructional design and the fact that we're dealing with ill-structured problems. Dave Jonathan and Dave Merrill, all these guys, that we're dealing with ill-structured problems, and that our job is to really come into a situation and not bust out some template, but to say, here's this situation that we maybe haven't seen before, maybe we've seen something similar to this before, and think through it and think about what your approach should be and think about the strengths and weaknesses and sort of recognize where you're going to leave things on the table and have to come back and look at that later and determine whether it's effective and all of that. That to me is the goal and the purpose of higher ed, at least in spirit. The execution is a completely different story. So
yeah, I hear that. Well, I want to explore that different story, but I also think about the higher education model came from hundreds of years ago,
sure.
and it was largely like the children of wealthy people that were, and I don't want to dismiss it, but it's almost like they needed something to do with their time.
Yeah,
Kids of the wealthy people.
Job. Yeah,
and they're going to go like philosophize and talk of these high level concepts. And now we have this model where, I mean, at least I'm about the same age as you. And a lot of us who were raised in the 80s, 90s, and even more so since then, there was this message of like, every kid has to go to college, no exceptions, no matter what. And I don't want to be dismissive of people, but maybe there's certain people that shouldn't. Maybe they would be better. Like we always hear about that the trades were understaffed for a large number of years because nobody thought about it. Everyone thought they had to go to college.
So in economics, right? I remember my undergrad economics class, and I'm no economist. So if somebody out there, like, please don't, if I'm bastardizing any of these concepts, but it's a class that really, it had a lot of concepts for me that were really useful. Equilibrium, right? This idea that if you don't mess with the market, it'll settle out. If you have too many shoe manufacturers and people aren't buying all the shoes, some of those shoe manufacturers are going to go out of business. And then maybe for a little while you don't have enough. And so shoes cost a bunch, but then it's going to even out. And at some point, you've got enough shoes for society. You've got the right amount of shoes for society. There's value in scarcity. Scarcity is what makes things valuable. Like diamonds, if there were diamonds on every corner, you could just go pick them up off the street. Nobody would care about them. But they take a lot of work, and there's a lot of concern around how they're developed, and you don't find them often. They're expensive. The same goes with everything, and there's a lot to that. I think there's value in education. I also think that we shouldn't live in a society where you're required to have a degree to do everything. And the fact that so many jobs now require a bachelor's degree as an entry-level skill means that the value of the bachelor's degree is not what it could be, or not what it maybe was, some number of years ago, right? So there's that whole concept of like, should everybody have an education? Like, I think there's a base level that we, in society need to be able to sort of understand basic math and manners and the way the road works and things like that. Government, we should have some basic ideas around that. But like, does everybody need to I don't know, go be an accountant or anything? I don't think so. And you can just think in extremes to sort of challenge that. If everybody was an instructional designer, then there would be no value in being able to create a course and think through those, not no value, but the value would be diminished.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and there's obviously certain technical job fields like a surgeon or an engineer that requires a lot of education to even go into that workforce. And then there's other jobs like I was someone who changed my major multiple times. And actually at one point I was going to be an economics major, and I still am fascinated with the concept because it's just so interesting. But I ended up majoring in business management. And I'm like, I've learned more about business management from being in the business world and doing things and failing and, reading books and listening to podcasts than I did from any of my university courses.
Yeah. Well, that's execution, right? I mean, that's the execution versus the spirit. I'll back up just a second. So certainly being a surgeon is a skill that takes years to get the basics to where you can even start, and then years more to get any good at it. But pretend for just a second that we have the Matrix type ability to sort of implant surgery into your head. And now all of a sudden you've got your 10,000 hours in surgery because you plugged the jump drive in the back of your neck. Everybody can now do surgery. I could, do surgery on somebody in my family, like on the table, which don't ever do that, right? But like assuming in this scenario you can, and you can do it safely and productively. The value then, surgeons aren't making $500,000 a year, right? Because everybody can do it. So what's the value? Like maybe it changes. Maybe the people who have actually learned surgery the old school way now become consultants or advisors. Maybe they're doing the sort of like dangerous surgeries, or maybe they're doing the ones that nobody wants to do, right? Like, it's just not worth it to me to download to, like, I don't know, remove a hangnail or something. So surgeons become on that level, right? But there's this, it's a system, and that system has regulatory sort of vibes, and when that system is reframed, it has interesting impacts and influences. So
Yeah, you mentioned advanced technology like the Matrix, but even Neuralink is being worked on, and
yeah,
we might still be decades away from something like
sure,
that. But I do think about technological advancement. I don't know if you're aware of this, but Google offers cloud certifications for different programming fields, and then
right,
they'll hire people who take these 3 or 6 month certifications with no degree. So
yeah,
hypothetically, a kid who's 18 could go take one of these cloud certifications, get a job at Google at age 19,
yeah,
and bypass the degree.
yeah,
And then you talk about surgeons, there's AR and VR training out there.
right,
I think more VR for a surgeon, where it almost seems like they are operating on a patient, but
yeah,
it's just a VR situation. So I do think technology is going to help us to do things differently than we did in the past. It doesn't have to be lectures and books and presentations and
right.
but so let's shift back to the university thing. What what are the things that you think that our modern university system needs to do better at in order to serve the people going through it?
Yeah. Well, and so a lot of the things that you just said, that Google has through Coursera, massively open online course platform, right? They have work ready, job ready certifications, like the IT certification my son's going through right now. And the idea is that you can, excuse me, the idea is that you can go through these programs and be ready to be hired. And you're right, there's this alternative. If you can work for a year or two learning how to program and go get a six-figure job, right? You don't have to go to school. And I think that's a beautiful thing. The question that always sort of runs through my mind, whether we're talking about instructional design or higher ed or whatever, is what is it that we do that can't be automated, right? What is it that we do that, like, provides the value above and beyond, just sort of what anybody can get. And that's always that's a living question. It's always in negotiation. The thing is like, not everybody in the world has the fortitude to go learn how to program. And if they do, programming takes sort of a distinct personality set. It's not for everybody. And that's good, because if it was for everybody, then there wouldn't be much value in programming, right? The same with plumbing, and the same with working on an air conditioner, and the same with, government and all kinds of stuff. And so I think higher ed gives, one of the benefits of higher ed is that it gives you, at least in theory, a safe space to sort of spend some time thinking about what it is that you want to do with your life. And I know that to varying degrees, that is up and down. You mentioned a little while ago that higher ed was originally mostly for more affluent people who had time and space to sort of spend 4 years doing nothing. And that is certainly not the case for a lot of people today. And I get it. I'm in that pile, right? Like, I had to work through school. It wasn't something where I could just sort of float around and do what I wanted. But on some level, to differing degrees of execution, the idea is that it's a dedicated time for you to think about what you want to do. And if you take advantage of it, like I went and talked to all my professors, and really, like, the more I talked to them and the more different ideas that I had, the more that I realized, like, okay, well, I love economics, but I learned that economics professors don't make as much as, say, marketing professors. So I didn't go that route, right? Because I learned something about the job prospects. And I like marketing, but marketing, to me, as much as I love marketing, feels like sort of leveraging human psychology to filch people for their wallets on some level, right? Like, I don't mean
Yeah.
but because it's an intriguing field. But what we've gotten into, especially with the data and everything, is this ability to, like, sort of influence people into making decisions that they may not actually want to make, right? And so to me, that was something where I had some values problems with that. And I wouldn't know that, right? I wouldn't know that if I didn't spend some time thinking about it. So certainly that's one. Exposure to a lot of different ideas is one, where you just see a plethora of different things that are possibilities for your life. And there are challenges with that also, because if something's not on the menu, you don't know it exists, right? If you go to a restaurant and let's say it's like a fusion restaurant, and there's like Jamaican and Vietnamese and Thai food and whatever, but you don't see any, like, Russian food, for example. Do you know it exists? I don't, if it's not on the menu, maybe it's not offered as an option. So that becomes a challenge. Um, there are lots of benefits, I think, to spending some time sort of honing your skills. It helps you think more critically, in theory at least, because you're looking at all these different topics from different lenses. Hopefully your professors are challenging you, right? You shouldn't just sort of present one side of the issue. You should really present both sides of the issue, even if this is the right way, but there's another way, and this is why that way isn't as good as this way, right? I mean, it's important to sort of think differently about what the alternatives are. But I think higher ed's coming into a situation now, especially there's this enrollment cliff that we've sort of known was coming for decades, and everybody thinks they're going to be the university that isn't impacted as much as the other ones, right? It's that whole Xerox strategy where, like, we know copiers are going out of business, but we're just going to be the last one in business. There's this enrollment cliff where we know there aren't going to be as many students. And at the same time, they've somehow found a way to like inflate tuition in unreasonable, by unreasonable amounts, and top heavy administration and that kind of thing. To where school's a different beast than it was even 10 years ago, So
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the first thing I want to touch on is I really want to go to that Jamaican Vietnamese Thai restaurant. That sounds like some really good fusion there. But yeah, I don't want to keep on talking about colleges the whole episode, but I think the inflated budgets, I mean, that happens in public schools below the college level too. We're spending on the wrong things. And I think the important thing is we just need to have these conversations, and we need to explore different routes. And if there are alternative avenues like the Google certification or some of these exciting schools for younger kids that are trying different routes, we need to test that and not just like be stuck in the old way. I see a lot of change in this industry. And in fact, I see these trends on LinkedIn of the term transitioning teacher. I know you were kind of forced to transition because of the COVID pandemic, like a lot of people were. But why do you think there are so many teachers that are transitioning out of education and more towards business?
So I'll back up just a second. I am a transitioning teacher, like technically, but not in the same spirit that like most of the other transitioning teachers are. I'm a transitioning instructional design teacher, right? Like I've been practicing and teaching instructional design for 12 years. So it's not like I've been teaching social studies and all of a sudden I found instructional design and I'm interested in it. Like I've got more than a decade of experience in it, but I've felt the same sort of resistance that a lot of the other teachers who are actually coming from K-12 or whatever have encountered when transitioning the field, just because I happen to have to transition around the same time as them. So that's something. I think that if you're just looking at trends and economics, like it's an interest, but it's not something I'm amazing at. So my personal perspective on this is there always have been a lot of K-12 teachers in instructional design programs. In my experience, it's just always a majority of the people who are making up the instructional design program students are K-12 teachers. That happens to be, I think, because instructional design happens to be housed in education colleges most of the time. It could be housed in psychology. It could be housed in business, right? Because it just depends on sort of what lens you take. I said at the beginning, it was described to me as sort of the intersection between business and, and psychology and teaching or technology or whatever. And that it could just as well be in any of those other colleges, right? Because it just it's a multidisciplinary sort of field. It just happens that for a long time, teachers got raises when they got a master's degree or a doctorate, and instructional design was sort of an easy lift to go from teaching in K-12 to building, curriculum and that kind of thing. Now, I think there's a lot of challenges that, K-12 has always had its own space. I've had my own challenges with K-12. But K-12 teachers work really freaking hard, and they're underpaid, and they deal with a lot of crap. They've got parents yelling at them. It's much like the restaurant industry, I would imagine, having not worked in K-12 myself. I've been chewed out because somebody didn't like the way I cooked their eggs. I can only imagine what kind of crap they deal with when somebody doesn't like the way that they treated their kid, or their kid comes home and says whatever. I've heard a lot of stories where like teachers are getting chewed out for stuff because the kid's not doing what they're supposed to do. So when all of that came to a head and the pandemic hit and everybody shut down, it wasn't like, well, we really need to be concerned with like the students learning, losing their learning, right? It wasn't like, how do we keep these kids learning stuff? It was, who's going to babysit the kids, right? That was the thing we kept hearing.
Yeah.
What am I going to do with my kids while I'm working? Not how do I help them continue to learn and grow. And some of that, my own personal opinion, probably got to do with the execution side of education, right? Like we should be producing a product that people want, even in a pandemic. They should be going, holy crap, what am I going to do without my K-12? You know, I mean, if the internet goes down, I'm not, my concern is to get connected. It's not, you know, to think about like, I don't know what the service guy is going to do or something. It's, I want my internet running. And that's because it's a valuable product. And I think there's some space there. But society, in a lot of ways, looks at K-12 teachers as babysitters, which I think is terrible, but I think it's probably real. So.
Yeah, I could see that. You know, as someone who's worked in various forms of telecom for years, I do kind of understand what kind of things can cause your internet to go down, and you don't even know about those. Just turn the router off and on, and that'll fix it about half the time.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, you know, I think one of the most unfortunate things about the COVID pandemic was the impact on kids, and we're still seeing it play out, and we're going to probably still see it play out for a long time. But I get that. I get that the teachers are the ones who, even if we do spend more on school, it never goes to them. It always goes somewhere else. And then, you know, they probably get issues from their administration, from the kids, from the parents. So I get that. And I've talked to a lot of transitioning teachers on LinkedIn, and I'm glad to see their enthusiasm. And I think that the one thing I'll touch on with this, or I want to hear your thoughts on, is if they have that background that is more of a school type subject, social studies or whatnot, and they don't have the business background, or they don't have the instructional design background you do, what do you think are some things that the people like that can focus on to develop themselves and help make that transition more smooth?
Yeah, that's so. I'll just sort of reiterate that I have not worked in K-12. I've taught a lot of K-12 teachers. And so my perspective is probably different. And all the things that I'm saying about K-12 is just my own perspective based on being a student and based on sort of talking to people who are teachers. And I think teachers are some of the hardest working people in the world. They care a lot in general, in my experience. And, you know, I want nothing but the best for them. I also realize that there's an uptick in boot camps and things like that, especially around the pandemic, because there's so many people looking to get out of the classroom for whatever reason, because it's dangerous, because whatever, because it's just time. There's so many people looking to get into instructional design. And here's where we get into some conversations about the role of instructional design and the relevance and the meaning of instructional design. In higher ed, my experience in instructional design started in higher ed, and I went through a doctoral program, a pre-doctoral program. So I learned theory and application and all this stuff. And all the things that I learned, this whole bookshelf behind me, is instructional design models and learning theory and approaches and conditions and triggers and all this stuff, color theory, like everything. And on the other side of that, like throughout that time, we're talking about human performance technology and organizational challenges, and how the instructional designer plays a critical role in organizations, because organizations face a performance challenge. And then they go through this process to do a root cause analysis, and they say, okay, our bank tellers aren't doing what they're supposed to do, or whatever. We get to the bottom of that, and it's either a performance issue, like we need to move the refrigerator closer to the production, or we need to change the incentive structure, or something like a non-training problem, or it's a training and skills deficit, and we need a knowledge skills deficit, and we need training, some sort of training to solve that. That's where instructional design comes in. And so instructional design is framed, at least in higher ed, as this space where we're impacting the organizational bottom line. And what ends up happening, I think, is we hear that and we see all that theory, and we get to the other side of that. And at least in my experience, what instructional design has turned out to be is a lot of e-learning, a lot of e-learning order taking. It's not like when somebody comes to me with a course and says, hey, I need a course on cybersecurity training, that I have a lot of leverage to say, well, why do you need that course on cybersecurity training? What type of problem are you actually trying to solve with that? How does that go? because that doesn't get me very far. They say, where's your e-learning portfolio? Let me see what you can do in Storyline and Rise. Do you have any graphic design skills? Are you good at voiceover? Can you make media? That's what they care about. And I think for better or for worse, that's what we've reduced ourselves to as a field. And the challenge with that, in my opinion, is that those are among the least valuable things that we can do. And in 10 or 20 years, they'll probably be outsourced. They'll have AI doing stuff like that. So the question becomes like, what is it that we're doing that's different, that's not outsourceable, right? That goes beyond that. And so having those learning theories and all of that stuff is really important because it informs the way that you make decisions around design, right? If you understand cognitive load, then you think about that when you're developing slides. If you understand basic design principles or color theory, things like that, you think about that when you're building e-learning. And all of that stuff, I think, is critical. But the system around that, I think, has full of problems with the way that we've executed it, because a lot of the e-learning that we make shouldn't be e-learning, and a lot of the e-learning we make should probably be something different. So to tie that back to your question, what can you do if you're a K-12 teacher or something looking to get into instructional design? It pains me to say, but I would honestly just polish up your storyline skills and polish up your Rise skills and read a couple of books. Like I read Robin Williams, the Non-Designer's Design book. I'd probably read Kathy Moore's Action Mapping book. I'd probably read Design for How People Learn from I should know this because I did an interview with her and I can't remember her name right now. Design for How People Learn. I have to Google that one up. People are going to scam me for not remembering that name.
We'll throw it in the show notes. We'll look it up afterwards.
Thank you. But I mean, there's a handful of books like that I think you can get a good sort of handle on the basics. Does that make you a full-fledged instructional designer? No. Does it get you in the door? Absolutely. You're now a junior programmer, right? Like you're ready to go in and like fiddle with the code. They're not going to touch you with the heavy lifting stuff, but you can go in there and boost and follow. So that's what I would do. I would just make it as fantastic as possible and build a portfolio.
You know, I like a few things you said there. You know, one you called out the challenges with a e-learning course is not always the best solution, but you should still learn the skills to produce it. So I think that's really good. And I also like what you ended on there, where you talked about the fact that just learn the bare minimum, so to speak, right? You read these couple of books and understand these basic concepts. One thing I notice is a lot of folks who work in the L&D field, whether it's designers or in other aspects of the field, tend to be very academic minded and want to learn everything and know the entire process. It also puts us in a silo sometimes where we're just kind of talking academic L&D stuff to other L&D people, and we don't think of the skills that actually would push the business forward. You know, maybe skills outside of just the L&D space. And I know you specialize in project management. So tell us a little bit about why you approach L&D from a project management perspective, why you're going down that road.
Yeah, for sure. I've had this opinion about sort of the role of e-learning in instructional design for a long time. And I got into instructional design to teach. So when I got out in that period and people were saying, well, we need to develop a professional development course, or we need to learn how to use this new technology that we're adopting so we can train everybody else on it, or we need to make this entire library of knowledge base articles. Like that to me wasn't super thrilling. It wasn't the thing that was like making my motor turn. And there's this Maya Angelou quote that I'm going to butcher, but it's something along the lines of like, do the best you can until you know better. And when you know better, do better. It's along those lines, right? Like, and that advice for the portfolio as well. Just do what you can, but focus on those sort of core things. I realized early on, like, if I have to spend my whole career banging out instructional videos and knowledge base articles and stuff like that, I am not going to be happy. I don't want to do that. I don't want to take faculty support calls all the time for how to set up the grade book and stuff like that. I just feel like a surgeon drawing blood or something. Like I'm just not sort of living up to my potential. So I started trying to find ways to escape, which is weird, right? Because I just invested a bajillion dollars in getting a doctorate in this field, and only later realized how hard it is to find a teaching job in this field. But the thing that I did, instead of sort of being chained to the desk doing instructional design, was I tried to get involved in all these strategic initiatives. And every time there was some macro level thing going on where we were designing an open badge ecosystem or designing a semi-automated training course for how to use Blackboard, or eventually that grew, right? Like I helped introduce hybrid teaching at a university that didn't have any hybrid teaching or online teaching at all. And so there was a quality assurance piece and a training piece and a helping, supporting the faculty and building piece, and sort of being involved in the steering committee and being involved in the strategy behind all that led to other things where there was a data analytics platform that they were implementing, and they were a year and a half in and it wasn't where it needed to be. And they asked me to take it. And that's really where I cut my teeth on project management, because I had this 4x8 whiteboard on the wall, and I was just trying to keep track of where everything's at, because this is a campus-wide rollout of a data analytics system with lots of moving parts, and it's already stagnant. So the president's like, where's this thing at, and I'm suddenly working for the associate provost, and right. And so there's just a lot of things happening. My interest then in project management, some of it stemmed just from the way that I sort of naturally think about things and think about problems. Some of it stemmed from the fact that I was sort of interested in higher level, more, conceptualized things, implementation work and theory and that kind of stuff. And so this idea that I almost couldn't be satisfied just building e-learning courses and things like that. Some people love it and it's for some people, and that's great. But for me, it just didn't fit. I just needed more and different, if that makes sense, more organizational ties. So that was where I sort of started. And just since then, I've really thought a lot about what it takes to get an initiative started, how to define things in a way that you can communicate it to people that they understand, thinking in systems, right, which is foundation for instructional design. How does this influence that? What happens if I change this thing? Like, what are all the pieces that are impacted? That more systems level perspective, macro level strategic initiative piece is what sort of drew me into project management. Plus, it just feels good to knock something out, right?
Yeah, I hear that. And you called out something important, is that everyone has a different tolerance for this. Some people like to become an expert in one field. Some people, and I think I'm similar to you, want to learn different disciplines. One of my favorite books is the book Range by Epstein. Not sure if you've read it, but it talks about how generalists, if you learn a little bit about a lot of areas, you can become a lot more effective. Now, some people do need to be specialists as well. And so that person that's maybe been an instructional designer for 20 or 25 years and they're the best at the craft, they're important too. Yeah, but then there's also those of us that need to kind of be chameleons and fit into multiple roles.
Yeah, and instructional design is in a lot of ways a generalist type field. Like a little while ago, I said, well, you need to know how to use video and do voice editing and create graphic design and build e-learning. Those are really distinct separate jobs. At one point, design and development was a completely separate job, but we've crushed those together over the years. And now being an instructional designer means you have to have a lot of sort of basic level skills in graphic design and script writing and video editing and voiceover and audio and technology and design and development. It's not like you can just go do this and sort of specialize in one area very easily, right? Like it's just not like that anymore. But with that said, we'd be in real trouble if somebody wasn't on top of all the latest changes in the tool. But that's not for everybody,
Yeah, we need the storyline. Sorry.
Oh no, yeah, we absolutely need the storyline. But one of the challenges is if you're not super into storyline, because that's sort of become the bulk of what we get hired to do. I'd say storyline, e-learning development. If you're not deep into the e-learning development, because that's the bulk of what we do, where is the space for the other people? I think that's one of the big challenges, sort of from a systems or ecosystem perspective.
Yeah. And I also think about making yourself more valuable, even if you are an e-learning developer and that's your full-time job. I'm a big fan of performance support and thinking about how can you support people as they're doing their job. E-learnings are notorious for you have to pause your job, go away from the job to do the learning. So learning about that, or learning about the operations of your business, maybe learning a little bit about marketing, like we said earlier. I think a lot of learning teams don't do a good job marketing their services to their potential clients. The one thing I want to touch on that I think the maybe more established e-learning field doesn't really address is like smaller businesses with either a very small L&D team or no L&D team, and just the leadership there is coming up. What experience do you have working with people that might either be on a budget or they're bootstrapping their learning programs? I've worked with companies that their training is, Susie from HR covers this topic, and then John from over here covers this topic. How can you be more organized and manage it when you don't have those resources?
Yeah, and I know that we're pushing up on time, so I'm good, but I want to make sure that you're good.
We'll make this the last question.
Okay, sounds good. I think there's a lot that you can do, and this is the same problem a lot of like solo practitioners face. Like I have an LLC, I do consulting, and the thing is like I've only got so many hours. I can either spend those hours working on client work or marketing or tracking data or polishing my LinkedIn profile to try to get more customers, right? But I can't do all of those things. And so on some level, you have to be really strategic about what you're doing. And I think you have to do the same sort of thing. Like you recognize, like if you're a small L&D, you need to think about what the sort of minimum viable product looks like. What's the base level of that I can get away with? And you have to also recognize things that you're good at and not good at. I can do voiceover work for internal things, but you do not want me doing voiceover work for like a commercial or some professional training that's going to thousands of people. It just wouldn't be as good as if you hired a voiceover artist, right? And so knowing that, I'm going to budget that in if I ever do those types of proposals, and be really clear about sort of the shortcomings if somebody needs to hire me for voiceover instead of somebody else. And so that sort of recognizing where your limits are is important, and it's essential if you're dealing with a small time sort of shop. So if you've just got Susie from accounting developing accounting training, recognize that Susie from accounting is not an instructional designer and doesn't have all the learning theory and sort of best practices and experience of polished over time. Like I've looked at metrics and things like that. And if you're an instructional designer, go back and look at your data, see where people are falling off of your training, do some formative evaluation, do some focus groups, see what people are responding to and not responding to. If you don't have the luxury of doing that, if you're Susie from accounting, sort of get the basics down, right? I can't remember. There's the first 20 hours. I think it's Josh Kaufman has this like first 20 hours YouTube TED Talk, and the idea is good. It's this idea of like the Tim Ferriss popularized too, right? And I don't know how necessarily valid it is, but the concept is good. That like if you want to learn ukulele, for example, which was his example, you learn the basic chords and just sort of the four or five basic chords, and then you get into a session where you can do loops of producing some activity and then getting feedback. And getting feedback's the hard part. I think getting feedback's the value of higher ed or having a mentor or something like that. Because when you do something, it's really hard to giving somebody feedback takes time. But if you can get to a space where you're producing small increments of something and getting feedback on that iteratively over and over and over again, you get better and better at it. So all that ties back to if Susie from accounting wants to make something, I would say keep it simple. Don't go trying to learn storyline if you can do it in PowerPoint. If you've never edited a video before, like maybe think about doing it with images instead, right? Think about the simplest sort of path toward where you're trying to go. Recognize that it's not necessarily going to be some high level, top quality product, but it might be minimum viable and get the job done. And just sort of shore up the weaknesses. Make sure that you're paying attention to common presentation things. How many words are on the slide? You're thinking about accessibility, which I think is critical and should be integral to every design. But look up some accessibility principles to think about alt text and contrasting colors and those closed captioning in videos and things like that, because all of that stuff's important. So and if you can afford it, hire an instructional designer at the very minimum to come in and look at your problem and give you some advice on it, even if you're not going beyond that. So
yeah, that's great advice. I think a lot of people, and especially with the economy tightening, I think a lot of people are going to be operating with a tight belt. I like the idea of keeping it simple, operating in a more of an agile, iterative type approach. maybe even outsourcing or curating from Susie or whoever else. Maybe it's not the prettiest content, but I always say functional is better than pretty.
Yeah.
So that's all great stuff. Like you said, Fred, we're coming close. So before we close out, I just want to give you a chance. Where can people find you or connect with you?
Oh yeah. So it's Fred W. Baker, all one word, Fred W. Baker, and it's fredwbaker@gmail.com. If you want to email me, please don't email me anything bad. But if you want to email me something funny, I'd love it. Fred W. Baker on Twitter, Fred W. Baker on LinkedIn. And please, I'd love to connect with you. I'm interested in moving into project management more fully, but I've got a ton of years in instructional design and in higher ed, and I'm always happy to help and chat. So yeah, reach out to me.
Awesome. Well, Fred, I'll put all those links in the show notes so that people can connect with you. I know that I've gotten a lot of value from posts I've seen from you.
Sure.
The one question I want to ask you before we close out, I ask every guest. So what's something either personal or professional that you've learned lately that has benefited you?
Yes, this is good. And you warned me about this. I am in the middle of learning, not the middle, I'm in the beginning of learning to play the guitar, which is what I've always wanted to do. I'm not great at it by any means, but I'm sort of learning finger picking. I am a big proponent of using like Obsidian for note taking. And so like if you look up linking your thinking on YouTube, I can't remember the guy's name, but linking your thinking has this like 6-part getting started with Obsidian video. Very good to sort of think about how to take notes and link notes and all that stuff. So I'm sort of making that more robust. And I've been bullet journaling for years and I love bullet journaling, but I'm switching now to using Kanban, using Microsoft Planner and time blocking my calendar every day. So to me, I'm still experimenting with that, but that's the thing that I think I'm sort of learning at this point and getting a lot of benefit from. So
awesome. Well, hey, I asked you for one, you gave me 3, and good luck on the guitar. That's going to be a lifelong journey for you, I'm sure.
Hey, it's fun.
But Fred, it's been great chatting with you. I hope we do it again sometime.
Yeah.
Have a great day, and everybody, we'll talk to you next time.
Yes, same to you, Adam. Thanks. Bye, everybody.